Hey class, welcome back. And today we are going to talk about the New Deal, which is Franklin Delano Roosevelt's response to the Great Depression. So last time we met, we were talking about the Great Depression and we were talking about the Hoover administration. So today we're going to begin by talking about the Dust Bowl, which is an environmental, man-made, really environmental catastrophe that happens in the Southern Plains at the same time as the Great Depression, causing hardship for thousands, hundreds of thousands of people in that region. And then we're going to talk about the election of 1932 and the presidency of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, also known as FDR. And then we're going to talk about some of the highlights of his plan to recover the nation out of the Great Depression, known as the New Deal. Okay, so we're going to talk now about the Dust Bowl and kind of the origins of the Dust Bowl. So during the 19-teens and the 1920s, there was an event that happened in the Southern Plains of the United States known as the Great Plowup. This is when 5.2 million acres of thick native grasslands were basically converted into wheat fields. Now, this was great when World War I was taking place and the nation was feeding not just the US, but also Europe. And it was also great during the 1920s, which was a decade of relative prosperity. But when the Great Depression hits, wheat prices drop dramatically from $2 a bushel to 40 cents a bushel. And the response that the Southern Plains farmers have is to plow up more acres to create a bumper crop. And this causes, of course, more grasslands to be disturbed. Then what happens is there's a drought. And this drought will begin right around 1933 and last about 8 years. And when that drought hits, 850 million tons of topsoil will basically dry up. And then you have these big windstorms that come along that create these massive dust storms. So there's a huge, huge problem here. Not only do you have people who are unable to sell their crops or that their crops have been devalued to the point where they no longer can afford their mortgages or their land payments, but then of course you also have this huge environmental catastrophe with these massive dust storms. Now, this is not just an environmental catastrophe, it is also a health hazard because this dust that blows for several years across the Southern Plains is getting everywhere. It's getting into people's ears, it's getting into their eyes, it's getting into their lungs, it's causing respiratory illness. So this event known as the Dust Bowl is going to have two major impacts. The first is that it is going to transform the way that farming practices are done in the Southern Plains. Secondly, it's going to lead to a massive migration of people out of the Southern Plains regions to other parts of the country in order for them to be able to survive. So here you see an image like the image before of a massive dust storm, and it gives you a sense of the size of these storms. They were sometimes miles wide, you know, hundreds if not thousands of feet high, and they were completely dense in dust, so it would just blacken the sky. And it was nearly impossible to keep the dust out of your home or anything. I mean, people tried everything in order to try to keep the dust out of their homes, but mostly to no avail. So here you see a map that shows the major concentration of the region known as the Dust Bowl. So here you have the panhandles of Texas and Oklahoma, but also parts of Kansas, Colorado, and New Mexico. Other parts of the country did experience dust storms during this time period as well in the 1930s, but this is where the concentration of the really bad dust storms were, and that's a direct result of that great plowup. So, as I mentioned, there were lots of people that leave these regions and go to other places across the country in order to, survive this event. And there's a huge migration, especially of people to California. These people were generally referred to as the Okies, and they came to California with their particular sort of southern agricultural rural lifestyle, and many of them settled in the Imperial Valley and also in the Central Valley. So if you click on this link right here, it will tell you a little bit more about the Dust Bowl. But just remember that this is happening simultaneously with the Great Depression. So for many of these people that had to live through this event, this was really a double whammy, a double suffering for them, leading again to these mass migrations and ultimately to a change in farming practices where people become much more conscious of the land that they are plowing up and also planting certain grasses and legumes and things like that in order to hold down the topsoil in the event of a windstorm. Okay, so this is an electoral map that you are looking at here, and this is an electoral map of the election of 1932. You will notice that it's a massive landslide win for the Democratic candidate, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And that is because Herbert Hoover, if you remember last time, had the unfortunateness of becoming president during the Great Depression or right before the Great Depression broke out. And so he was unable to respond to that financial crisis effectively. And on top of it, he also evicted the bonus army marchers from Washington, D.C. So he was hugely unpopular in the 1932 election, and that's why you see such a landslide win for Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Franklin Delano Roosevelt had been the governor of New York at the time that the Great Depression broke out, and he had responded to the Great Depression effectively at the state level. He had enacted statewide programs and poor relief for unemployed people. And because of that, he had won national notoriety. And so people knew that he was an effective leader in this time of financial crisis. Okay, so now we're going to turn to talking about FDR and a little bit about his biography and his life. He is considered one of the most important and influential U.S. presidents. He was reelected to the presidency three times. He was elected four times altogether. So Roosevelt comes from an old New York family. He was the fifth cousin to Theodore Roosevelt. He grew up in a manor along the Hudson River, Hyde Park Manor, and his family had owned that home for more than 200 years. Um, he was the only child of a younger mother and a much older father. As a child, he traveled extensively, and he also attended boarding schools where, as a student, he didn't really shine. Unlike his fifth cousin Theodore, he was not really an academic. His abilities were more in his abilities to build relationships. That's sort of where his natural strength was. He ends up going to law school, but drops out in 1907, but he is able to pass the New York State Bar. So he does get a law degree. 2 years before he drops out of law school, he marries Eleanor Roosevelt, who is the niece of Theodore Roosevelt, in 1905. So basically, he and his wife are distantly related. After he graduates, or he passes the state bar and becomes a lawyer, he will become a New York State senator at the New York State Assembly level in 1910. And then in 1913, under the Wilson administration, becomes the U.S. Secretary of the Navy. And then in 1921, a real tragedy happens. He is stricken with this disease, which doctors believed at the time was polio. He was paralyzed from the waist down. He was only 39 years old, but it is very unusual to get polio at 39 years old. And this completely changes his life. I mean, he drops out of politics basically for the duration of the 1920s. He switches his attention to try to work on recovering and learning to walk again. And eventually he sort of teaches himself how to stand up using these really heavy duty braces, and feels confident enough by 1929 to go back into politics, where he runs for governor of New York and wins. And this, of course, is at the same time of the Great Depression breaks out. And, you know, most people that study FDR in his life believe that his illness really gave him the sense of compassion and responsiveness that was necessary to be an effective politician in the time of crisis like the Great Depression. So now we're going to talk about the Great Depression and FDR's response to it. So while he was campaigning, he promised the American people a new deal, a new deal. And what he meant was that he wanted to create a government that responded to this crisis. And he was willing to put money, federal dollars, into responding to this financial crisis. So let's look at some of the programs that FDR implemented during the New Deal. So I'm going to break up the New Deal into two parts. The first New Deal, which roughly is from 1933 to 1935, and then the second New Deal. Now, the first New Deal was marked by a huge slew of legislation. In his first 100 days, Roosevelt will basically pass 15 pieces of congressional legislation. This is huge, right? This is basically unprecedented in the amount of federal response and federal laws that were being passed in such a short period of time. This legislation was specifically aimed at helping farmers and industry workers, the unemployed, and really most importantly, the banking system. If you remember back to our lecture on the Depression, the banks were really suffering, right? Banks were closing left and right. People were making runs on the banks to withdraw their deposits and finding that there was no money in the banks for them. So one of his first priorities was to restore confidence in the banking system. So that was one of the first things that happens. And so there's actually a suspension of banking activities for 4 days. That's called the bank holiday. And then there was the Emergency Banking Act. And the Emergency Banking Act had lots of different components to it. But I'm going to focus on one or two, actually, of the biggest parts, but it's all housed under the Glass-Steagall Act of 1933. So the Glass-Steagall Act of 1933 did two things that were very important. The first was that it separated commercial and investment banking. So basically what you have with the Glass-Steagall Act is you have a commercial banking system and an investment banking system. And in the commercial banking system, those banks were forbidden from taking deposits and putting them into the stock market, into risky investments. And then if you wanted to make those types of investments, you could go to an investment banking firm. So that was really an important thing, because that then protected people's deposits in commercial banks, because people typically use commercial banks. That's the type of bank that you would use to go and deposit your paycheck, for example, or to hold your savings accounts. So this is creating that separation so that the commercial banks are not engaging in risky investments. The second thing that it did was it created the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, also known as the FDIC. So the FDIC insures deposits that are made by individuals in their banks. So if anything happens to your money in an account, the federal government insures those deposits. So at the time that the FDIC was created, they insured deposits up to $5,000. Now they insure deposits up to $250,000 per account. So it's been raised substantially since 1933. Now, one of the things you should know about Glass-Steagall is that it does get repealed eventually, at least the separation of commercial and investment banking. It doesn't get repealed until 1999, but it does eventually get repealed. But the important thing about Glass-Steagall is that Glass-Steagall is going to restore confidence in the banking system. That's the main thing that you want to know about Glass-Steagall, and the fact that it separates commercial and investment banking. So Glass-Steagall was a positive step in getting people to have confidence in putting their money in the banking system once again. The Security Exchange Act was also part of the Emergency Banking Act. This is an act that creates the Security Exchange Commission, which is the SEC. This commission is tasked with overseeing the operations at the U.S. stock market to ensure that trading is happening legally, that there are no things like insider trading and those types of things. So very important in terms of creating confidence in the banking system once again. The other thing that FDR does on a regular basis to make the American public feel better is something called his Fireside chats. This was when he would give these weekly radio broadcasts out to the nation, and he would speak to the American public in a very sort of plain and simple way, in which he would tell people, give people updates about what the federal government was going to do for them, tell them, that the federal government was there for them, and it was just sort of these reassuring updates for the American people. And this really endeared Roosevelt to the American people. People would gather around the radio every week to listen to Roosevelt's fireside chats. Eleanor Roosevelt, FDR's wife, also had regular weekly radio addresses to the nation as well. Okay, so after his first 4 years of enacting his New Deal, Franklin Roosevelt was at the peak of his popularity. He wins a huge landslide victory in the 1936 election. As you can see from this electoral map, all of the states there in blue went to Roosevelt. Okay, so now turning my attention to talking about the second New Deal. And again, there was a lot of other legislation that was passed during the New Deal, but this lecture is focusing specifically on what I think are the important elements of the New Deal and some of the more lasting pieces of legislation. Beginning with the Social Security Act. So the Social Security Act was passed as part of the Second New Deal package in 1935. This was something that had been discussed for quite a while, ever since the outbreak of the Great Depression, really. Various governors and people across the country had been talking about creating some kind of social safety net, social security for the elderly, specifically for people that are, didn't have any kind of pension of their own and basically got old and couldn't work and needed to be able to have some kind of funds to live off of. So the Social Security Act was passed, and this, of course, created these pensions for the elderly. And the way that it worked was this really unique sort of system in which if you were young and able to work, you would pay into a system that would then pay out to the people that were currently elderly, and so on and so forth, so that when you got older and you needed to retire and draw off of your Social Security, that there would be young people that would be working and paying into it. So it kind of paid into itself like that through this cycle of old and young. And that's the way that it worked. Also, with the Social Security Act came some unemployment insurance, which of course was extremely important in this time of really high unemployment rates. And then another part of this act was to create these funds for states where they could then create like welfare type of accounts for aid for dependent children and also for public health services. Now, some of people were left out of these benefits, and particularly domestic and agricultural workers, they tended to be left out of these benefits. And the reason for that was because the Social Security Act and the National Labor Relations Act, which we're going to talk about next, was specifically aimed at getting industry and manufacturing back up on its feet. So it had a very sort of specific target group. And you could also argue that there was an element of discrimination here because agricultural and domestic workers were overwhelmingly part of minority populations. So there was that as well. Now that's not necessarily what happens today. That's just when it was where it was back in 1935. Since then, the Social Security Act has expanded, and different public relief programs have been developed since then, such as public housing programs in the 1960s, the food stamp program also in the 1960s. But the Social Security Act is important because it is really the first federal act addressing the needs of people who are elderly, who are poor, and who are unemployed. Moving on then to talk about the National Labor Relations Act, also known as the Wagner Act, and also passed in 1935. This is an act that finally protects unions. This protects a worker's right to strike. So it used to be, prior to the Wagner Act, that if you went out on strike, your employer could fire you for doing so. This says no. If you are an organized worker and you go out on strike, then your employer now has an obligation to engage in collective bargaining. So collective bargaining is when workers and employers sit down and work out a contract together. So they work out, pay schedules, they work out benefits, they work out any kind of safety concerns. Those types of things are all written into a collective bargaining agreement. And so this National Labor's Relation Act protects the unions, so it gives them the right to collective bargain for their contract and also the right to strike if they cannot agree upon a contract. So similar to the Social Security Act, it did also exclude initially agricultural and domestic workers, but since then that has changed through lots of fighting through, for example, the United Farm Workers, Cesar Chavez and others working hard to get recognition of agricultural workers. But in 1935, this was specifically aimed at unions and mostly industrial manufacturing unions. The final thing I'm going to talk about here in the second New Deal is the Works Progress Administration, also known as the WPA. Now, this was created in 1935 and it lasted until 1944. So it is not one of the pieces of legislation or the federal agencies that last, to present day, but it's really important in that it's a really unique program in a lot of ways. So um, this was a program that provided 8 million jobs to Americans. And it was very unique in that basically it took Americans and whatever skill set they had and tried to find a way to put them to work. So, for example, if you were an out of work writer, you could get a job with the WPA doing writing projects. If you were an out of work artist, you could get a job with the WPA doing works of public artworks. If you were somebody who was an out of work circus performer, the WPA had a circus that it sponsored. So it went above and beyond just big public works projects like building roads and tunnels and things like that. It also, employed people that had different types of skill sets. If you were a musician, you could work for a WPA band. So it was unique and it was a really innovative program, and it was quite successful for its time. So here are some examples of WPA murals done by WPA artists. And you can see examples of this still in the public landscape throughout the United States. These are murals that were done at post offices. Here are some examples of graphic art that was done by the WPA. Again, the government employing artists to, send out these public service announcements. Again, not necessarily, not a necessity, but still something to get people to do their skill, to have a job, and to get a paycheck. So there's a lot of rhetoric around the New Deal, right? And the reality is that the New Deal and its programs did not reach everybody. There were a lot of people that were left out of New Deal programs. Most notably, people sort of on at the service level of industry, agricultural workers, domestic workers, as we've already mentioned, people in the service industry in general. There were a lot of migrant and immigrant populations that were left out of the New Deal. And so you really have to look at the rhetoric versus the reality. And also all the New Deal programs didn't necessarily fix the U.S. economy. It did improve it, but there was still some, ups and downs. And when we get to 1937 and 1938, there's a little bit of another recession that takes place because of cutbacks in government programs. And after 1936, Franklin Roosevelt's popularity starts to decline, and some of his political opponents start to really oppose putting more money into New Deal programs. So that slows the progress as well. There was a lot of opposition in government to putting money into programs to help people, right? There was some people really believed that businesses should be helped and that individuals should not be helped. But the Roosevelt administration understood that the country was really a consumer country, and if you put money in the pockets of people, that they would go out and spend it. So it did improve the economy to a certain degree, but the improvements were gradual and they weren't dramatic. And some people really saw no relief at all, and had to work and had to suffer throughout the entirety of the New Deal. We talked about Florence Owens, who you see pictured here, who was photographed by a WPA photographer by the name of Dorothea Lange. And you can see her here with a very worried look on her face. A reporter, after the end of the Depression, actually hunted her down to ask her, how did you make it through the Depression, and did you ever find any relief? And she said, we never saw a dime of the relief money. So it really depended upon what population you were in. If you were somebody who could get a job with the WPA, if you were somebody who was in industry, and if you were somebody that had a special skill set, you might be able to find some relief in these programs. But for people like Florence Owens, for people like migrant farm workers, it was very unlikely that you were going to see any relief as a result of the New Deal programs. Okay, and as I mentioned before, FDR's popularity begins to wane after 1936, and in 1937, he does something that makes his popularity even worse, which is that there's a big scandal called the court packing fiasco. Now, Roosevelt was fearful of the Supreme Court. They had already ruled during the first New Deal, they had ruled several of his programs unconstitutional and basically cut them off completely. And he did not want the Social Security Act or the National Labor Relations Act to be ruled unconstitutional. So he proposed something called court packing. He proposed that he be allowed to appoint additional Supreme Court judges for every justice that was 70 and a half years old or older. And this was, of course, very politically unpopular because it would have increased the amount of Supreme Court justices and then given him influence over the Supreme Court. This is kind of one of those things that when you have an idea, you should probably just keep it to yourself. But he didn't, and it made him even more politically unpopular. And you can see here by this cartoon, this political cartoon that shows him kind of hovering over the Supreme Court as if he wants to control it. And this was something that was on a lot of people's minds in 1937, that it seemed as if FDR wanted to have control over the government. And this made a lot of people suspicious, and it made a lot of people not trust his ideas and his political agenda. So by the end of the 1930s, the U.S. is on a very slow road to recovery. In order to get that recovery happening, the federal government is going to grow to unprecedented levels. The federal government is going to be bigger than it ever had been in the past, with various new federal agencies to address the problems of the Great Depression. By the 1938 election, people were starting to question how much power a president should wield. And so in the 1938 election, which was an interim election, a bunch of Republican senators and representatives are going to be voted into Congress. So FDR is going to have a much harder time getting his legislation past the Congress after 1938. And then also what's happening just on a global level is that we see a rise of fascism and fascist powers in Europe. Mussolini in the 1920s, and then Hitler and the Nazis in the 1930s. And so ultimately, it will be the war that will end the United States' greatest economic depression. And that is where we are going to turn our attention to next is World War II. Thanks.